In 1952, on the side of US Route 25 in Corbin, Kentucky, a 62-year-old man named Harlan Sanders stood in a rebuilt roadside restaurant beside a pressure cooker, a sack of flour, and a secret blend of herbs and spices that he guarded like military intelligence. His earlier service station had burned. His first business had nearly collapsed. The new interstate highway system had not yet arrived. But the old road outside his door was already crowded with hungry motorists, families, truck drivers, and salesmen moving through the American South in a country falling in love with speed. By the middle of the 1950s, Americans were eating billions of pounds of chicken a year. Broiler production had surged from a regional farm practice into a national industry, with birds bred to grow faster, cheaper, and heavier than almost anyone a generation earlier would have thought possible. A meal that had once required catching a chicken, killing it, cleaning it, cutting it, seasoning it, and standing over hot fat had begun to shrink into something a person could buy beside a highway in a paper bucket. And at the center of that transformation was not gold, not oil, not wheat, not sugar, fried chicken, a bird cut into pieces, dredged in flour, dropped into fat, and cooked until the skin becomes crisp enough to crackle under your teeth. Today, it is so ordinary that you can find it at gas stations, airports, supermarkets, stadiums, school cafeterias, wedding buffets, and drive-through windows glowing under fluorescent light at midnight. It can cost less than a coffee. It can arrive at your door in a cardboard box, still steaming, carried by someone following a blue dot on a phone. That sounds simple, almost too simple. So how did a humble piece of chicken, once a special occasion farm food, become a billion-dollar obsession? How did it travel from jungle birds and sacred omens to enslaved kitchens, segregated train platforms, pressure fryers, fast food empires, Korean beer halls, Nashville spice counters, and global delivery apps? That was 1952. But the story of fried chicken does not begin in Kentucky, or even in the American South. It starts thousands of years earlier, in the forests and villages of South and Southeast Asia, where the wild ancestors of the chicken scratched through leaf litter, called before dawn, and stepped, quite accidentally, into human history. But before you go there, pause for a moment in that Kentucky restaurant, because the scene tells you almost everything about the modern world fried chicken was about to enter. You have to picture the road first, not the interstate, not yet. US Route 25 was one of those older American arteries, the kind that carried commerce, migration, tourism, and boredom through small towns long before exit ramps and chain hotels made travel feel standardized. People were driving farther than their grandparents had. They were eating away from home more often. They wanted food that felt familiar but appeared quickly. They wanted something hot, salty, filling, and reassuring. Chicken fit the moment. But here is the twist for much of history. Chicken was not cheap everyday meat. Beef, pork, fish, beans, grain, and whatever could be hunted or preserved often mattered more in ordinary diets, depending on where you lived. A chicken was valuable alive. It laid eggs. It reproduced. It announced the morning. It could be sacrificed, traded, fought, admired, or sold. Killing one for dinner was not always casual. In many rural households, it was a decision. Think about that for a second. Today, a chicken sandwich can feel like the default backup meal, the thing you order when nothing else sounds risky. But for countless families across centuries, chicken was Sunday food, guest food, Wedding food, festival food, food worth saving for. Not because it was rare everywhere, but because wasting a productive animal was not how survival economies worked. In a world where a hen could keep giving eggs, the bird in the yard was not just meat, it was future food. That matters because fried chicken's history is not only the history of a recipe, it is the history of how humans changed the chicken, and then how the chicken changed humans back. It is a story about domestication, trade, empire, slavery, migration, industrial science, racial stereotypes, entrepreneurship, advertising, and appetite. It is about the smell of hot lead in a small kitchen, the hiss of meat lowered into fat, the sting of pepper and cayenne, the sweetness of a biscuit beside it, the paper napkins going translucent with grease. It is also about hatcheries, feed conversion ratios, cold chains, slaughter lines, franchising contracts, and labour so repetitive that a body can be worn down by the same motion thousands of times a day. This was not just dinner, it was a system, and fried chicken became powerful because it sits at a strange crossroads. It feels homemade. Even when produced by a corporation, it feels regional. Even when sold on 5 continents, it feels nostalgic. Even when the bird was bred in a laboratory-like agricultural system that would have astonished most farmers in the 19th century, it is comfort food with an industrial engine hidden underneath it. The comfort is real, so is the engine. Now, in the beginning, no one set out to create a global fried chicken empire. No ancient farmer looked at a red jungle fowl and imagined drive-through windows, pressure fryers, paper buckets, secret recipes, celebrity meal promotions, or debates over who has the best chicken sandwich. That would be absurd. It would be like looking at a wild grass seed and imagining a birthday cake in a supermarket freezer. And yet, that is how food history works. Small decisions accumulate. A bird is tolerated near a village because it eats scraps. A rooster's crow becomes useful. A hen's eggs become valuable. Traders carry birds in baskets. Soldiers carry them across frontiers. Cooks learn that hot fat transforms skin. Enslaved people preserve technique under violence. Freed people turn food into business. Engineers redesign the bird. Marketers redesign the craving. One change seems small at the time. It is not. By the late 20th century, fried chicken had become one of the most recognizable foods on Earth. Kentucky Fried Chicken opened restaurants far beyond the United States. Local cooks adapted the form everywhere it landed. In Japan, fried chicken became part of convenience store culture and, through one of the stranger marketing triumphs in food history, part of Christmas. In South Korea, fried chicken and beer became a social ritual known as chimaek, from chicken and maekju, the Korean word for beer. In Nigeria, Ghana, the Caribbean, Britain, Brazil, the Philippines, and beyond. Fried chicken entered existing traditions instead of simply replacing them. That is important. Fried chicken did not conquer the world by staying pure. It spread because it was adaptable. Some versions are brined, some are battered, some are double fried, some are tossed in garlic soy glaze, some are dusted with chili, some are served with waffles, rice, pickles, gravy, plantains, hot honey, white bread, or nothing at all except a small packet of sauce that somehow matters more than it should. Dry humour aside, the sauce packet is serious business. Because once a food becomes global, it becomes emotional. People fight over it, they rank it, they defend the version they grew up with, they insist that one city, One grandmother, one gas station, one church kitchen, one late-night counter, one chain, or one neighborhood spot has the only correct answer. Fried chicken is not merely consumed, it is judged. But beneath that crisp surface is a much older question. Why this bird? Why this method? Why did frying, one of the most ancient cooking technologies humans ever developed, meet chicken in such a perfect and consequential way? To answer that, you have to go back before the pressure cooker, before the bucket, before the roadside restaurant, before the plantations of the American South, before the Scottish frying pan, before the Roman banquet, before the Persian trader, before the Greek omen reader, before the first written recipe. You have to go back to the bird itself, because fried chicken could not become a billion-dollar obsession until chicken first became chicken, and that story begins not with the fryer, but with a forest. Before fried chicken could exist, before a skillet could hiss, before flour could cling to skin and fat could turn pale meat golden, there had to be a chicken. That sounds obvious. It is not. Because the chicken is one of those animals so familiar that your mind almost skips over it. You have seen it printed on egg cartons, painted on kitchen signs, shaped into nuggets, roasted under supermarket heat lamps, and reduced to the most ordinary word in the meat case. Chicken. It feels plain. It feels domestic by nature. It feels as if it has always belonged beside humans. But the first chicken was not a plump white bird in a wire pen. It was not heavy-breasted, quiet, fast-growing, or obedient. It was a forest bird, nervous, quick, bright-eyed, and loud. The main ancestor of the domestic chicken was the red jungle fowl, Gallus gallus, a small pheasant-like bird native to South and Southeast Asia. Picture a rooster with a burning red comb, copper feathers, green-black tail plumes, and a body built for scrambling through brush rather than sitting in a farmyard. The hens were subtler, brown and camouflaged, better suited to disappearing into dry leaves. They did not look like the supermarket bird. They looked like something that belonged to the edge of the forest. And that edge is important. The story likely begins not in one clean dramatic moment, but along the boundaries where forests met human settlements, especially in the mainland Southeast Asia. For a long time, scholars argued over older dates, with some claims placing chickens in northern China many thousands of years earlier. But more recent reassessments have made the picture stranger and, in some ways, more intimate. The chicken may not have been dragged into village life by force. It may have been lured there by grain, rice. Think about that for a second. The bird that eventually becomes a fast food empire may have first approached people because humans were growing rice, storing rice, dropping rice, and creating little islands of food around their homes. Fields attracted insects, harvesting spilled grain, settlements made scraps for a small jungle bird. A village margin was not a prison, it was an opportunity. That is how domestication often begins, not with conquest, but with proximity. Some animals run from us forever, some tolerate us. A few find something useful in us before we find something useful in them. Dogs may have followed camps. Cats may have followed rodents into grain stores. Jungle fowl may have followed rice. No one had to understand genetics for this to work. They simply noticed. The birds that stayed closer were easier to catch. The calmer ones were easier to keep. The louder roosters were useful. The hens that laid near houses were valuable. Generation by generation, human preference pressed gently, then firmly, on the bird. They did not know the word genetics. They were doing it anyway. Now, you should be careful here, because chicken domestication is not as tidy as the storybooks want it to be. Bones are fragile. Bird remains are easy to misidentify. A pheasant bone, a jungle fowl bone, and an early chicken bone can be maddeningly similar after thousands of years in the ground. Some older claims may be wrong. Some dates remain debated. The chicken's ancestry is also complicated by later interbreeding with wild jungle fowl populations. In other words, the chicken did not leave the forest once and become modern overnight. History rarely gives you a clean doorway. It gives you a muddy threshold. Still, by roughly the 2nd millennium BCE, domestic chickens were appearing in parts of Southeast Asia. And from there, they began to move outward with people, trade, ritual, and curiosity. But at first, they were not necessarily prized as meat. That is the part many modern viewers miss. The earliest chickens may have mattered less as dinner than as sound, symbol and spectacle. A rooster announces dawn with impossible confidence. If you have ever lived near one, you know this is not a gentle pastoral detail, it is a command. It cuts through sleep. It ignores your schedule. It declares the morning whether or not you have agreed to participate. For early agricultural communities, that call could feel powerful. The rooster seemed to summon the sun. It marked time before clocks. It stood at the border between night and day, darkness and labor, danger and visibility. Across later cultures, roosters would become creatures of warning, courage, fertility, masculinity, vigilance, and divine attention. The bird was small, but its voice was enormous. That matters because humans do not domesticate animals only with their stomachs. They domesticate them with stories. In parts of Asia, the rooster became connected with ritual and omen reading. In later Indian tradition, chickens appear in religious and symbolic contexts, though their status varied enormously by region, caste, custom, and period. In China, the rooster would become one of the 12 animals of the zodiac, associated with punctuality, confidence, and order. Now, zodiac systems developed long after the earliest domestication process. So do not imagine the first rice farmers naming calendar years after barnyard roosters. That would be skipping several thousand years ahead. But the later symbolism tells you something real. People saw personality in this bird. They saw noise, they saw heat, they saw aggression, they saw dawn, and yes, they saw fighting. Roosters are territorial, and humans, being humans, noticed. Cockfighting has deep roots in several ancient societies, and while the exact origins are difficult to pin down, it likely helped carry chickens across cultural boundaries. This was not fried chicken yet. This was not even chicken as everyday food. This was status, gambling, masculinity, entertainment, and ritual violence gathered around a bird that weighed only a few pounds. Here is the uncomfortable little irony. The chicken's road to your dinner plate may have passed first through the arena, not the oven, not the fryer, the arena, because an animal that can travel in a basket, reproduce quickly, make noise, lay eggs, fight dramatically, and survive near human settlement is an animal people carry with them. Chickens were portable in a way cattle were not. These are useful in a way purely decorative birds were not. They were alive storage, walking alarm clocks, ritual objects, and potential meals. Storage, in a world without refrigeration. This mattered more than modern abundance allows you to feel. A living chicken did not spoil. It could be fed on scraps. It could turn insects, spilled grain, and household waste into eggs and eventually meat. It was not just a bird. It was a small biological machine, converting the leftovers of human life into food. That is the quiet genius of the chicken, and yet, for all that usefulness, it remained tied to landscape. The earliest domestic chickens were still close to their wild relatives. They were leaner, flightier, more seasonal, less productive, and far less standardized than modern breeds. Some laid fewer eggs, some were kept for fighting, some for ritual, some for sacrifice, some, eventually, for the pot. There was no single chicken economy yet. There were many small human-bird relationships scattered across villages, fields, forests, river valleys, and trade paths. Then came movement. Once people began carrying chickens away from their native junglefowl range, the bird changed meaning again. A creature that had been ordinary near the forests of Southeast Asia could become exotic somewhere else. Strange animals have a way of gathering prestige when they travel. The further they move from home, the more stories cling to them. This is one of the oldest rules of trade. Distance creates value, and so the chicken began to move westward and northward, into worlds that did not yet know what to do with it. Traders carried it. Migrants carried it. Seafarers carried it. Armies eventually carried it. With every journey, the bird gathered new roles: omen bird, fighting bird, egg bird, sacrifice bird, luxury bird, medicine bird, meal. Not yet the center of $1 billion fried empire, but the foundation was being laid, feather by feather, field by field, dawn by dawn, because the chicken's first great power was not that it was delicious. Many animals are delicious. Its power was that it could live beside humans almost anywhere humans could feed it. It could cross borders quietly. It could become familiar before anyone realized how much it had changed the world. This is where the story begins to widen. The forest bird becomes a village bird. The village bird becomes a traveler. The traveler becomes a symbol. And once a symbol enters the hands of priests, kings, soldiers, and merchants, it stops being merely an animal. It becomes history. By the time chickens reached the first great civilizations that recorded their world in writing, they had already become more than birds. They were omens, they were offerings, they were fighting animals, they were medicine. They were household wealth, small enough to tuck under one arm and important enough to appear in ritual life. And this is where you begin to see one of the strangest features of chicken history. Chickens are ordinary because they are useful, but they become powerful because people keep attaching meanings to them. A cow can be wealth. A horse can be conquest. A sheep can be clothing and meat, but a chicken, especially a rooster, seems to stand at the threshold of things, night and morning, silence and sound, life and sacrifice, peaceful yard and sudden violence. That made it useful to priests. In ancient South Asia, chickens were known early, though their status varied widely across regions and traditions. In some settings, they were eaten. In others, they were avoided. In still others, they appeared in sacrifice, divination, and folk practice. You have to resist the temptation to imagine one single ancient Indian attitude toward chicken, because India was never one thing. It was languages, kingdoms, castes, climates, trade routes, religions, and food rules layered over one another like sediment. But the bird mattered. Texts and later traditions connected roosters with martial energy, fertility and ritual power. In some Hindu iconography, the rooster appears as a symbol associated with Skanda or Kartikeya, a god of war in several traditions. That does not mean every village worshipped chickens, obviously. Nobody was building a chicken empire in the way later empires would build sugar islands or tea monopolies. But the rooster's aggression and dawn call gave it symbolic force. The bird was small, the meaning was not. Meanwhile, farther west, chickens moved into the Iranian world and the ancient Near East. One of the old Greek names for the chicken was sometimes linked with Persia, which tells you something important even if the linguistic trail is messy. To many Mediterranean peoples, the bird seemed to come from the east. It was foreign enough to be interesting, familiar enough to be useful, and noisy enough to be impossible to ignore. The Persians valued the rooster partly for the reason so many agricultural societies did. It announced the day in Zoroastrian tradition. The rooster came to be associated with the fight against darkness and evil, a creature whose cry helped drive away demons and wake the faithful to proper order. Now, as with many ancient religious details, you should be cautious about projecting one text across all people and all centuries. But the symbolism fits a broader pattern. Again and again, humans looked at this bird and saw a boundary guard, not dinner first, a sentinel. Think about that for a second. The same animal that modern supermarkets sell as skinless, boneless convenience protein once stood in the imagination as a little warrior against the night. That is the engine of this whole story. Sacred one century, discounted the next. Feathers, then flesh, then franchise. By the time chickens entered the Greek world, they had become especially visible as fighting birds and omens. Themistocles, the Athenian general famous for his role in the Persian Wars, was later connected in legend with fighting cocks. One story says that before the Battle of Salamis in 480 BCE, he saw roosters fighting and used them to inspire his soldiers. Now, historians debate the story, and you should not treat every patriotic animal anecdote as literal military reporting. Ancient writers loved moral examples. They loved scenes that made courage visible. But the fact that the story exists at all tells you something. A rooster's fight could be read as a lesson in courage. That is absurd and revealing at the same time. A bird scratching in dust becomes a symbol for soldiers defending a city. A farmyard brawl becomes military philosophy. And no, the rooster did not ask for this role. Humans assigned it, as humans tend to do. In classical Greece, chickens also appeared in medicine, sacrifice, and daily life. The philosopher Socrates, according to Plato's account of his death, told his friend Crito that they owed a cock to Asclepius, the god of healing. That final instruction has been interpreted in many ways, and scholars have argued over its meaning for centuries, but on the surface, it points to a simple fact. A cock was an acceptable offering. A bird could pay a spiritual debt. A chicken could settle accounts with a god. That is not a small thing. Then Rome absorbed the bird and made it practical at imperial scale. The Romans were fascinated by signs, and sacred chickens became part of state divination. Military commanders sometimes consulted chickens before battle by watching how they ate. If the birds ate eagerly, the omen was favourable. If they refused, the gods were apparently not in the mood. Here is the detail that makes this strange. Roman military decisions could, at least ritually, be tied to the appetite of chickens. There is a famous story from the First Punic War about the consul Publius Claudius Pulcher, who supposedly became furious when sacred chickens refused to eat before a naval battle in 249 BCE. According to later accounts, he threw them into the sea and said that if they would not eat, perhaps they would drink. The Romans then suffered a disastrous defeat at Drepana. Now, once again, ancient stories come to us filtered through politics, moralizing, and hindsight, so you should handle the exact dialogue carefully. But the lesson Roman writers wanted was clear. Ignore the chickens, and disaster follows, dry, deadpan, very Roman. But Rome did not only turn chickens into omens, it also turned them into farm animals more recognizably connected to food. Roman agricultural writers discussed poultry keeping, fattening, breeding, eggs, coops, and management. This was not yet the modern broiler industry, not even close, but it was a step towards system. A chicken was no longer merely exotic. It was being folded into household economy. Eggs mattered, meat mattered, sacrifice mattered, entertainment mattered, one bird, many uses. And because Rome built roads, moved soldiers, traded across seas, and carried habits into conquered territory, chickens spread more deeply into Europe. They were not the only birds people ate. Geese, ducks, pigeons, game birds, and wild fowl all had their places, but chickens had an advantage that kept repeating across history. They reproduced quickly, they required less space than larger livestock, and they could live close to people in crowded settlements. That was everything. In a world without industrial refrigeration, reliable transport, or modern animal feed, small livestock were not cute background scenery. They were household strategy. They converted scraps into eggs. They provided protein in a compact form. They could be sold when cash was needed. They could be slaughtered for guests, festivals, illness, childbirth, mourning, and celebration. The chicken was not luxury in every context. It was not poverty food in every context either. It moved between meanings. That flexibility is what made it durable. Pay attention to this next detail, because it explains why chicken could later become the perfect fried food for so many cultures. It was intimate. Pigs and cattle often required communal labor, land, butchering knowledge, and preservation. Chickens could live at the doorstep. Women, children, enslaved people, servants, peasants, monks, soldiers, innkeepers, and merchants could all manage chickens in different ways. The bird crossed not only borders, but social layers. It belonged in courts and courtyards. It belonged in temples and markets. It belonged in kitchens and military camps. That wide social range set the stage for everything that came later. A food cannot become globally beloved unless it is first globally available, and chickens were becoming exactly that. Slowly, unevenly, with detours through ritual and spectacle, with sacred meaning in one place and supper in another, with a rooster crowing over dawn in villages that had no idea their small bird would one day be bred by the billions. Billions, but not yet. For now, the chicken was still travelling. Rome had given it roads. Persia had given it symbolic fire. Greece had given it stories of courage and sacrifice. South Asia had given it ritual depth and long familiarity. Everywhere it went, it gathered another layer, and then the bird kept moving. Across deserts, across seas, into Africa, into Northern Europe, into monastic yards and royal kitchens, into places where people would misunderstand it, value it, restrict it, breed it, fight it, eat it, and eventually drop it into hot fat. The skillet was still waiting. By the time the chicken moved beyond the Mediterranean world, it had already learned the first rule of global history. Travel changes meaning. A bird that seemed ordinary in one village could seem magical in another. A creature raised for eggs in one household could become an omen in a royal court. A fighting animal in a marketplace, a medicinal ingredient in a monk's notebook, or a curiosity traded along roads where spices, silk, horses, metals, stories, and diseases moved together. The chicken did not spread like an army in a straight line. It moved unevenly, in baskets, on ships, through caravan towns, in the baggage of migrants, in the camps of soldiers, and in the small exchanges that rarely make it into royal chronicles. A trader brings a few birds because they can lay eggs during a journey. A family carries hens because a living animal is safer than spoiled meat. A sailor keeps chickens aboard because they are compact, noisy, and useful. No grand plan, just usefulness in motion. Across Africa, chickens became part of local food systems long before Europeans arrived on the Atlantic coast in force. The details varied by region, and the timing was not identical everywhere. But by the first millennium CE, chickens were known in several parts of Africa through Indian Ocean trade, Nile Valley connections, and overland routes. On the eastern coast, the sea mattered. Monsoon winds carried merchants between South Asia, Arabia, and East Africa, and with them came cloth, beads, ceramics, rice, bananas, coconuts, and animals. Chickens fit that world beautifully. They were small enough for ships. They reproduced quickly. They could survive in coastal settlements and inland villages. They did not require the pasture land of cattle, or the same kind of investment as larger livestock. In many African societies, chickens became food, wealth, offerings, and social currency at a household scale. They could be given to guests. They could be used in healing or divination. They could be traded in markets. They could feed a family without requiring a feast. This was not empire yet. It was adoption. That distinction matters, because when a food moves into a new culture, it does not simply arrive unchanged and demand obedience. People make it local. They feed it local grain. They season it with local ingredients. They connect it to older beliefs. They cook it in older pots. The chicken becomes part of the place that receives it. Meanwhile, in Northern Europe, the bird entered a colder, darker, more seasonal world. Chickens were present in early medieval Europe, but they lived alongside many other domestic animals and wild foods. Peasants might keep them close to the house. Monasteries might manage poultry with careful routines. Lords might receive poultry as rents or dues. Eggs could be useful in kitchens that followed religious calendars, especially when rules about meat shaped the rhythm of eating. And here is where food rules begin to complicate the story. Medieval Christianity did not simply divide all foods into good and bad. It created calendars of fasting, abstinence, feasting, and exception. On certain days, meat from warm-blooded animals might be restricted, while fish could be permitted. Eggs and dairy were sometimes restricted too, depending on the period, region, and strictness of observance. The result was a world where what you ate was tied to time, class, confession, and authority. The chicken sat awkwardly inside that world. It was clearly a bird. It laid eggs. It scratched in yards. It was domestic. It could be festive. It could also be forbidden on particular days for ordinary people. These restrictions were not abstract theology. They shaped hunger, storage, markets, and the mood of the table. Imagine a calendar not as something on a wall, but as something that tells your stomach what is allowed. That is a different relationship with food. In Jewish and Islamic food cultures, chickens also had roles shaped by law, custom, and interpretation. Proper slaughter mattered. Cleanliness mattered. The question was not simply whether the bird tasted good, but whether it could be eaten rightly. Again, you see the same pattern. Chicken spread because it was useful, but it survived because it could be fitted into systems of meaning. The bird was adaptable. Humans were demanding. That combination built history. By the late medieval period, chickens were familiar across much of Europe, but they are not always central to the table in the way modern people might imagine. Wealthy households could serve capons, hens, and elaborate poultry dishes, often with sauces, spices, almonds, wine, verjuice, and thickened broths. A capon, a castrated rooster fattened for tenderness, was especially prized. It was not casual food. It was the kind of bird that announced status before anyone took a bite. For poorer households, a chicken might remain more valuable alive than dead. A hen meant eggs. Eggs meant protein, baking, trade, and survival. Killing the bird meant ending that future supply. So the chicken stayed in the yard until age, sickness, celebration, or necessity made the calculation change. Think about that the next time you see a bucket meal advertised like an afterthought. For most of history, the bird was a small bank account with feathers, but while Europe slowly folded chicken into its kitchens, ships were beginning to change the world. The movement of animals across oceans would soon become one of the defining forces of food history. Chickens travelled with sailors because ships were hungry places. A long voyage consumed food relentlessly. Salted meat spoiled, hardtack grew worms, water went foul, fresh eggs and fresh meat, even in small quantities, mattered. In a world of scurvy, cramped decks, wet ropes, rats, bilge water, and men sleeping inches from one another. A few live chickens were not charming farmyard decoration. They were insurance. Portuguese, Spanish, Arab, Indian, Malay, Chinese, and African maritime networks all helped move animals and foods through oceanic space. Long before any single empire could claim the story. But when European expansion accelerated after the 15th century, chickens crossed the Atlantic as part of a much larger and more violent exchange. Horses, cattle, pigs, sheep, wheat, sugarcane, and pathogens transformed the Americas. Chickens came too. Though the history of chickens in the Americas has a twist. There is evidence that Polynesian voyagers may have brought chickens to parts of the Pacific and possibly to South America before sustained European colonization. The exact interpretation of some archaeological finds has been challenged and re-examined, so you should not turn it into a tidy headline. But the possibility itself reminds you that Europe was not the only engine of movement. The ocean had many highways. Some were older than the maps Europeans later drew. Still, after Columbus and the Iberian empires, chickens became widespread in colonial settlements throughout the Americas. They were practical in frontier towns, plantations, missions, ports, and indigenous communities adapting under terrible pressure. Like pigs, they reproduced fast. Unlike cattle, they did not need vast herds. They could travel inland with settlers, soldiers, missionaries, enslaved people, and displaced peoples. The bird arrived inside conquest. That is important. Because no food crosses an empire innocently, chickens may seem harmless. But they moved through systems that also carried forced labour, land seizure, epidemic disease, and ecological upheaval. The same routes that carried poultry also carried chains. The same ships that carried food animals also carried enslaved Africans. The same colonial hunger for plantation wealth would later shape the conditions under which fried chicken became one of the most skillful, painful, and misunderstood foods in American history. The chicken was not responsible for conquest, but it travelled with conquest, and as the bird entered the Atlantic world, it met other histories waiting there. West African foodways, European frying habits, indigenous ingredients, plantation kitchens, scarcity, skill, violence, memory, improvisation. This is where the bird's journey begins to bend toward the skillet. Not all at once. Not yet. First, you need the other half of the story. You need fat hot enough to transform food. You need pots, pans, oil, lard, dripping, butter, and flame. You need to understand why frying was not just a cooking method, but a technology of texture, speed, flavour, and preservation. You need to see why crispness mattered, because chicken alone did not create fried chicken. Fire did, fat did, human patience did. And somewhere between ancient oil cookery and the kitchens of medieval Europe, people discovered one of the great simple miracles of food. Hot fat changes everything. Hot fat is older than fried chicken by thousands of years, before anyone in Scotland dropped a floured bird into a pan, before West African cooks seasoned chicken with layers of pepper and spice, before southern kitchens filled with the smell of lard and smoke. Humans had already learned that fat could do something fire alone could not. It could surround food. That seems simple, but stay with it. Because this is one of the great hidden technologies in cooking history. Fire strikes from below. Smoke drifts around. Boiling water softens. Roasting dries and browns, but hot fat wraps food in heat, clings to its surface, drives out moisture, and creates a crust. It turns soft edges crisp. It makes starch golden. It carries flavour into tiny cracks and folds. It changes the sound of food. The hiss matters. That sharp crackle you hear when battered chicken enters hot oil is not just kitchen atmosphere. It is water escaping violently as steam. The surface dries. Proteins brown. Flour becomes shell. Fat slips into the outer layer. The Maillard reaction. The browning chemistry that gives roasted coffee, seared steak, toasted bread, and fried chicken their deep savoury flavour, begins to work its quiet magic. People in the ancient world did not know the term Maillard reaction. They did not need it. They heard the sound, they smelled the result, they tasted the change. Frying appears in ancient food cultures wherever people had access to cooking fats and vessels that could handle heat. Olive oil made frying especially important in the Mediterranean, in ancient Egypt, Greece, and Rome. Cooks used oils and animal fats for a range of foods, including cakes, doughs, fish, vegetables, and meats. These were not always deep fried in the modern sense. With food submerged in a large vat of oil, often frying meant shallow pans, small quantities of precious fat, and careful attention. Fat was not disposable. That is the first thing you have to understand today. A restaurant can pour gallons of oil into a fryer and treat it as a cost of doing business. In earlier worlds, Fat was wealth. Olive groves took years to mature. Animals had to be raised, slaughtered, and rendered. Butter could spoil. Lard had to be stored. Every spoonful represented land, labor, weather, and time. So when someone fried food, they were making a choice. In a poor household, frying could be too expensive for daily life. In a richer one, it could signal abundance. In a street market, it could draw customers with smell before they saw the stall. In a festival, it could turn flour and fat into celebration. Frying has always had that double life. It can feel humble because the ingredients are simple. It can feel luxurious because the fat is costly. Simple food, expensive technique. The ancient Romans understood fried pleasures very well. Their cookery included dishes cooked in oil, and elite Roman kitchens could be extravagant, mixing spices, sauces, wine, herbs, honey, vinegar, and fermented fish sauce. Their poultry dishes were not fried chicken as you know it, but they show that birds and fat were already moving through sophisticated kitchens. Wealthy Romans ate chickens, capons, and other birds prepared with elaborate sauces, sometimes boiled, roasted, stuffed, or simmered. They liked transformation. They liked display. They liked food that announced status. But here is the catch. Fried chicken needs more than chicken and fat. It needs the right relationship between the two. A whole bird roasted over fire is old. A bird stewed in a pot is old. Pieces of bird cooked quickly in fat require a different logic. You need butchery that breaks the animal into manageable parts. You need a cooking vessel. You need enough fat to create rapid browning. You need seasoning. You need flour or some coating if you want the crust that later becomes iconic. And you need a culture that accepts the cost of using fat this way. That took time. Across the medieval Islamic world, frying became part of a brilliant and wide-ranging culinary tradition. Kitchens from Baghdad to Cairo to Al-Andalus used oils, animal fats, spices, nuts, herbs, vinegar, rosewater, and sugar in combinations that could be astonishingly complex. Medieval Arabic cookbooks include fried and layered dishes, meatballs, pastries, fritters, and foods finished in fragrant sauces. The Islamic world helped preserve, refine, and transmit cooking knowledge across continents, and its trade routes moved spices, rice, sugar, citrus, and techniques into new settings. This was not a side note. It was a bridge. When you later see European kitchens using spices from Asia, sugar from plantations, frying methods shaped by Mediterranean and Islamic influence, and birds that had travelled across ancient trade routes. You're not looking at isolated traditions, you're looking at connections. A recipe can be a map, even when it never admits it. In medieval Europe, frying took many forms. There were fritters, pancakes, fish fried for fasting days, small pastries, and meats cooked in dripping, lard, butter, or oil depending on region and wealth. Cookbooks from elite households recorded elaborate preparations, but most ordinary cooking happened without written recipes. That means the historical record is tilted. We hear more from courts and monasteries than from the tired woman standing over a smoky hearth deciding how to stretch the last fat in the pot. Pay attention to that silence. The absence of a written recipe does not mean the absence of skill. It often means the opposite. Ordinary cooks learned by watching, smelling, touching, and adjusting. They knew when fat was hot enough because a crumb sizzled. They knew when meat was done because the sound changed. They knew how to reuse fat, clarify fat, guard fat, and make flavour from scarcity. No cookbook, no thermometer, no celebrity chef. It worked. By the early modern period, frying was familiar across Europe, though unevenly distributed by class and region. In some places, olive oil remained important. In others, lard, suet, butter, goose fat, or beef dripping did the work. Scotland, which will matter soon, had a reputation for frying chicken in fat without the same heavy seasoning associated with later African American versions. England and other parts of Britain had their own poultry dishes, but the cultural path toward what Americans would later call fried chicken was not simply British. It was braided. That braid matters, because when Europeans crossed the Atlantic, they did not bring one single frying tradition. They brought habits, tools, animals, prejudices, hunger, and memories. Enslaved Africans brought food knowledge of their own, shaped by many regions, languages, crops, and cooking systems. Indigenous peoples had ingredients and techniques rooted in American landscapes. Colonial kitchens became places of forced contact, where violence and invention sat unbearably close together, and fried chicken would eventually emerge from that contact. But not yet as a franchise, not yet as a bucket, not yet as a national symbol. At first, it was a technique meeting a bird under particular circumstances. Chicken could be cut into pieces. Pieces could cook faster than a whole bird. Frying could produce a crisp surface without a large oven. Seasoning could make a modest bird feel abundant. The result travelled well once cooled, which would matter enormously in a world of work, church gatherings, markets, and later train journeys. Here is the part that does not get enough credit. Fried chicken became important partly because it was practical. It could be eaten hot, warm, or cold. It did not require a knife and fork in every setting. It could be packed. It could be sold. It could sit beside bread, greens, rice, yams, potatoes, pickles, gravy, or nothing at all. Its skin protected the meat. Its fat carried flavour. Its salt made you want another bite. Texture became portability. Portability became commerce. Commerce became culture. That is how a cooking method becomes history, not in one dramatic invention, but through 1,000 repeated acts. A pan set over flame, a bird cut up, flour seasoned, fat saved, a child waiting, a traveller fed, a market stall opened, a smell drifting into the street, and once hot fat met chicken in the right places. The next part of the story took shape around two powerful culinary inheritances. One came from Scotland, with its pan-fried poultry traditions. The other came from West Africa, with deep knowledge of seasoning, spice, rice, oil, and communal foodways carried across the Atlantic under conditions of terror. One influence supplied a method, the other helped supply a soul, and when those worlds met in the American South, fried chicken stopped being merely cooked poultry. It became memory. To understand fried chicken in the American South, you have to hold two places in your mind at once. Scotland, damp and cold, with hearths, iron pans, animal fat, and a practical tradition of frying pieces of chicken, and West Africa, vast and diverse, with oil-rich cooking, chilly heat after the Columbian Exchange, layered seasoning, rice knowledge, one-pot meals, communal eating, and foodways carried by people who were not migrating by choice. Neither place alone invented southern fried chicken. That is too simple. Food history rarely belongs to one ancestor. It belongs to collision, pressure, adaptation, and survival. It belongs to people making something meaningful with what they have, what they remember, what they are allowed to keep, and as they are forced to lose. The Scottish part of the story is often told quickly. Too quickly, sometimes. Scottish cooks had long used frying as a way to prepare chicken, often cooking the bird in fat rather than roasting it whole, in a climate and economy where ovens were not always the centre of daily cooking. Pan-frying made sense. A cut-up bird cooked faster. Fat helped with browning. A skillet could do what a large roasting setup could not. When Scottish and Scots-Irish migrants moved into parts of colonial America, especially into the upland south, they brought food habits with them, including poultry frying. But if you stopped there, you would miss the entire heart of the dish, because the fried chicken that became culturally famous in the American South was not just chicken cooked in fat. It was seasoned chicken. It was cared for chicken. It was chicken transformed by cooks who knew how to build flavour in layers. And many of those cooks were African and African-descended women working under bondage, coercion, and later economic restriction. Here is the essential distinction. Frying may explain the form, seasoning explains the memory. West Africa was not one cuisine. Say that clearly. It was not one country, one people, one recipe, or one flavour profile. The Atlantic slave trade tore people from Senegambia, Sierra Leone, the Gold Coast, the Bight of Benin, the Bight of Biafra, West Central Africa, and other regions, each with its own languages, crops, ritual practices, agricultural systems, and cooking knowledge. But across many of these food cultures, there were skills and ingredients that shaped the future of southern food. Rice cultivation, okra, black-eyed peas, leafy greens, ground nuts, palm oil in some regions, millet, sorghum, yams, fish, stews, peppers, spice pastes, and techniques for stretching flavour through sauces and slow-cooked pots. Then came the chili pepper. The chili was not originally African. It came from the Americas. And after the 16th century it travelled through Portuguese and other trade networks with startling speed. West African cooks made it their own, so completely that people often forget it had crossed an ocean first. That is one of the strange things about food. An ingredient can be foreign in origin and still become deeply local in use. By the time African food knowledge and American ingredients collided in the colonial South, pepper heat had become part of the language of flavour. Now imagine the plantation kitchen, not romantically, not as a cosy hearth scene from an old painting. Imagine heat pressing against the body. Imagine smoke in the eyes, wet wood snapping, iron heavy in the hand, grease spattering against skin, children nearby, commands shouted from another room, and the constant knowledge that your skill-fed people who claimed ownership over your labour and your life. The smell may have been beautiful. The system was not. In those kitchens, enslaved cooks combined European ingredients, Native American crops, African techniques, and forced improvisation. They cooked for enslavers at the big house and for their own families in quarters where rations were limited. Time was stolen, and fatigue was constant. Chickens, because they were small livestock, occupied a complicated place. Enslaved people were sometimes allowed to raise chickens for their own use or for small-scale sale, though the rules depended on the plantation, the owner, the region, and the period. That tiny allowance could become food, money, bargaining power, or a rare measure of control. Tiny does not mean trivial. A chicken in a yard could mean eggs for children. It could mean a bird saved for Sunday. It could mean something to sell in a local market. It could mean seasoning a pot, honouring a guest, feeding a preacher, or stretching dignity through food when almost everything else has been taken. And here is the part that should slow you down. In the hands of enslaved cooks, fried chicken was not simply copied from Europeans, it was altered, it was intensified, it was seasoned with salt, pepper, spice, and knowledge. It was cooked by people who understood fat, fire, timing, and texture from traditions older than the plantation itself. It became a dish where technique and memory met under violence. This was not fusion in the cheerful modern restaurant sense. It was forced convergence. There are no neat recipe cards from the first moment someone made what you would recognize as Southern fried chicken. Ordinary cooks rarely got the privilege of authorship. Their names were not usually printed. Their methods were absorbed, imitated, praised without credit, and later packaged as regional heritage. That missing credit is part of the history. The silence around the cook is not empty. It is evidence of who had power to write things down. So you have to listen differently. Listen to the ingredients. Listen to the method. Listen to the way chicken became associated with black cooks, black households, black churches, black travel, and black enterprise across generations. Listen to the fact that this association would later be twisted into racist caricature by people who enjoyed the food while mocking the people who made it famous. That cruelty comes later. For now, stay in the kitchen. The bird is cut into pieces. The pieces may be rubbed with salt and pepper. They may be soaked, depending on later household style, in buttermilk or brine. Flour catches the seasoning. Fat heats in cast iron. The cook waits for the right shimmer, not because a thermometer says so, but because experience does. Too cool. And the chicken turns greasy. Too hot. And the crust burns before the meat cooks through. The pieces go in carefully. The pan speaks, hiss, crackle, spit. The smell fills the room. This is where fried chicken becomes sensory memory, not just taste, but sound, timing, danger, and anticipation. It is not an effortless dish. It asks for attention. You cannot entirely walk away from it. You turn the pieces. You manage the heat. You watch the crust darken. You judge doneness without cutting into every piece and ruining the juices. You keep children from reaching too close. You save the fat. Because wasting fat would be foolish. In that labour, the dish becomes intimate. And because chicken could be eaten warm or cold, because it travelled well, because it felt special without requiring a whole slaughtered hog. It began to take on roles that were both practical and ceremonial. It belonged at Sunday dinners. It belonged at church gatherings. It belonged in baskets carried to fields, picnics, and markets. It belonged to the spaces where enslaved and later free black communities made meaning under pressure. This is where the story takes a turn toward commerce, because once a food travels well, it can leave the kitchen. Once it can leave the kitchen, it can be sold. Once it can be sold, it can become livelihood, and after emancipation. Black women in particular would use fried chicken in one of the most remarkable and underappreciated chapters in American food history. They would sell it to travelers. They would carry it to train platforms. They would turn skill into income in a country determined to deny them both safety and opportunity. A dish born from heat, labour, memory, and constraint was about to become a business, not a franchise yet, something braver. The story now enters its darkest room. not because fried chicken itself was cruel, but because some of the hands that perfected it were forced hands. Some of the kitchens that shaped it were built beside fields worked under threat. Some of the flavors that later became celebrated as Southern tradition were created inside a society that denied black people ownership of their bodies, their time, their children, and often even their names. You have to sit with that. By the 18th and 19th centuries, the plantation South had become one of the central engines of an American slavery. Cotton, tobacco, rice, indigo, and sugar moved through markets that connected rural violence to global finance. Ships carried crops to ports. Banks issued credit. Merchants insured cargo. Politicians defended property rights that included human beings. The dining rooms of plantation houses did not float above that system. They were inside it. Every meal carried labor. A chicken dish served on a white tablecloth might look domestic, even gentle, but behind it stood a chain of work-raising birds, gathering eggs, chopping wood, hauling water, rendering fat, grinding corn, tending fires, washing pots, preserving food, carrying plates, and cooking under surveillance. In many wealthy white households, enslaved cooks were expected to perform refinement without recognition. They prepared European-style dishes, regional foods, preserves, breads, sauces, sweets, roasts, stews, and fried foods, often for people who treated their skill as entitlement rather than artistry. This was not hospitality, it was extraction, and it was intimate extraction, which made it especially disturbing. Plantation slavery did not only exploit labor in fields, it entered nurseries, bedrooms, kitchens, sick rooms, and dining rooms. Enslaved women were made to nurse white children, clean white clothing, serve white guests, and feed white families, while their own families lived under the constant threat of sale and separation. The kitchen could be a place of expertise, authority, and community knowledge, but it could also be a place of heat, burns, punishment, exhaustion, and control. Picture it carefully. The air is thick with smoke and grease. The fire is hard to manage. The iron is heavy. The summer heat presses through the walls. A cook stands for hours, listening for orders, judging the pan by sound, and stretching ingredients with a precision that no one in the dining room bothers to record. The smell of frying chicken may be rich and comforting. The conditions around that smell were often brutal. Two truths at once. Food can be beautiful. The system that produced it can be monstrous. This is where people sometimes become uncomfortable. Because fried chicken is beloved. It appears at reunions, church suppers, family meals, funerals, celebrations, and holidays. It is tied to tenderness in many people's memories, but history does not ask us to stop loving food. It asks us to understand what the food has carried, and fried chicken carried a great deal. Enslaved cooks helped create what outsiders later called Southern cuisine. They worked with ingredients from Europe, Africa, and the Americas. They drew on West African knowledge of rice, greens, peppers, stews, and seasoning. They used corn, sweet potatoes, beans, pork fat, poultry, wild foods, and garden produce. They cooked under constraint and still made flavor. They built dishes that were practical, portable, celebratory, and emotionally powerful. That is not a romantic statement. It is a statement about survival. In some places, enslaved people were allowed to keep chickens near their quarters. This permission, when it existed, was never pure generosity. enslavers often allowed small livestock or garden plots because they reduced the cost of feeding enslaved workers, shifted labour onto people already overburdened, or created the illusion of paternalism. But enslaved families could still make those small openings matter. A hen could provide eggs, a rooster could be sold, a bird could feed relatives on a Sunday, a few coins from market sales could buy cloth, tools, tobacco, sugar, needles, or other goods that plantation rations did not provide. Small economies grew in the cracks of oppression. The cracks mattered. A chicken was light enough to carry, valuable enough to sell, and familiar enough to cook well. Fried chicken, once prepared, had another advantage. It held up. It could be wrapped, packed, carried, eaten later, and served without needing elaborate equipment at the moment of eating. That made it useful in market culture and travel. But its importance began earlier, in domestic and community life. A fried bird could mark a special day without requiring the resources of a large animal. It could honour a guest. It could turn scarce time into ceremony. But you should not mistake ceremony for ease. The labour was demanding. Killing and cleaning a bird was physical work. Seasoning and dredging required preparation. Frying required fat, and fat was precious. The cook stood close to danger. Hot grease burns fast and leaves marks. The pan had to be watched. The chicken had to cook through without blackening. Pieces had to be timed according to size. A skilled cook made this look natural, which is one reason the skill was so easily dismissed. That dismissal has a long history. People often treat domestic cooking as instinct when women do it, as heritage when communities preserve it, and as genius only when someone powerful sells it back at a premium. Fried chicken suffered from that pattern. The dish became famous, but the earliest cooks were rarely named. Their knowledge passed through hands, not headlines, through daughters, mothers, aunties, neighbours, church kitchens, and work kitchens, through taste rather than print. No monument, no patent, no signature on the bucket. And then came the cruel turn. White America celebrated black cooking while degrading black people. Plantation nostalgia, minstrel shows, advertising images, postcards, jokes, and later film and television would transform fried chicken into a racist symbol, using it to mock the very communities whose labour and skill had helped make it iconic. That did not happen accidentally. Stereotypes are not misunderstandings that simply appear out of nowhere. They are tools. They reduce people to appetite, body, speech, and caricature. They make inequality seem natural. Fried chicken was pulled into that machinery. It was not the chicken, it was the racism. Still, inside black communities, the dish remained something far richer than the caricature. It was food for Sundays, for visitors, for church gatherings, for strength after labour, for children who remembered the smell before they understood the history. It belonged to family authority and culinary pride. It belonged to the cook who knew exactly how much salt was enough, exactly when to turn the thigh, exactly how to keep the crust from falling away. That knowledge was real. So was the violence surrounding it. When emancipation came after the Civil War, freedom did not erase poverty, danger, land theft, wage exploitation, or racial terror. But it did change the possibilities around food. Skills that had been forced into service could now, in certain spaces and with great difficulty, become income. Chickens raised in yards could be sold. Meals could be prepared for travellers. Women who had been denied formal economic power could turn culinary authority into cash. And fried chicken was ready for that world because of everything it already was. Portable, recognizable, special, durable, delicious. The dish had been shaped under slavery, but it was not trapped there. It would move into freedom with people who carried grief, memory, and skill at the same time. It would appear in baskets, on tables, in churchyards, beside roads, and soon. At train stations where hungry passengers leaned from windows with coins in hand. The plantation kitchen had tried to turn black labour into someone else's comfort. The next chapter turns that labour towards survival after emancipation. Fried chicken stepped onto the road, not alone. It travelled with biscuits wrapped in cloth, boiled eggs tucked into baskets, pound cake cut into thick slices, coffee poured from dented pots, and fruit pies held carefully so the filling would not spill. But chicken had a particular power. It could be fried at home, cooled, carried, sold, and eaten by hand. It did not collapse when the journey was long. It did not require a dining room. It could meet hunger wherever hunger appeared. And in the late 19th century, hunger appeared at train windows. Railroads changed the American South with iron, steam, smoke, and schedules. They connected towns to cities, farms to markets, and passengers to places that had once taken days or weeks to reach. But the railroad world was not equally open to everyone. Black travellers faced segregation, insults, danger, and exclusion. White travellers, too, often passed through places where formal dining options were limited, especially before restaurant cars became common. Stations were noisy, dirty, and brief. A train might stop only long enough for passengers to stretch their legs, buy something quickly, and climb back aboard before the whistle sounded. That was an opening. Black women saw it. In towns across the South, women prepared food at home and sold it at depots and platforms. They were often called waiters, vendors, hucksters, or by local names that varied from place to place. In Gordonsville, Virginia, the women who sold fried chicken to train passengers became so famous that the town later claimed the title, Fried Chicken Capital of the World. That title is promotional. Of course, towns love a crown. But the reputation points to something real. Fried chicken had become commerce. Picture the platform. The train arrives with a shriek of brakes and a cough of steam. Soot settles on clothing. Metal groans. Passengers lean from windows. Vendors move quickly along the cars, lifting baskets, calling out what they have, trading food for coins before the conductor's signal ends the stop. The smell of fried chicken rises through coal smoke and summer heat. Hands reach down. Money drops, packages go up, speed mattered, trust mattered. The food had to be ready before the train arrived, and it had to be good enough that travellers remembered the station. That meant planning. It meant waking early, cooking in quantity, managing supply, judging demand, and surviving the uncertainty of weather, delays, competition, and police harassment. This was not quaint. It was business under constraint, and for many black women, it mattered because formal economic doors were locked after the Civil War. Formerly enslaved people entered freedom with little or no land, little cash, and a labour system that often tried to recreate slavery by other means. Sharecropping tied families to debt. Black codes and later Jim Crow laws restricted movement, work, voting, education, and safety. White violence enforced racial hierarchy with terrifying clarity. In that world, selling food was not simply a charming sideline. It could be one of the few ways to turn skill into money. A skillet became capital. A basket became a storefront. A platform became a marketplace. Think about that for a second. Long before the modern language of entrepreneurship, before brand strategy, before delivery apps, before ghost kitchens, these women were doing logistics. They bought or raised chickens. They secured flour, salt, fat, pepper, fuel, wrapping materials and baskets. They predicted passenger flow. They priced portions. They built reputations. They repeated quality without written manuals or corporate training videos. If the chicken was bad, people remembered. If it was excellent, people remembered that too. Word of mouth moved faster than timetables. This was not only food for white passengers, although white travelers were often customers. It was also food in a segregated travel system that denied black people reliable access to restaurants, hotels, and dining rooms. For black families traveling by rail, carrying food became a necessity. Fried chicken was ideal because it stayed flavorful when cold. It could be packed for a journey when there was no safe place to eat along the route. Later, this practice would become part of a much larger black travel tradition. During the Jim Crow era, families packed shoebox lunches for road trips because restaurants could refuse service. Gas stations could be dangerous, and stopping in the wrong town could put a person at risk. Fried chicken, boiled eggs, fruit, cake, and sandwiches became edible protection, not luxury, strategy. The shoebox meal was not nostalgia first, it was survival. That is the part that often gets softened in memory. Food stories become warm because food itself is warm. But the warmth sat beside fear. A family packing chicken before a trip might be expressing love, but also preparing for humiliation and danger. A mother might fry enough to feed children in a car because she knew there might be no counter where they would be welcomed. The smell in the box was comfort. The reason for the box was segregation. Still, people made beauty there. That is one of the great themes of this story. Again and again, fried chicken appears where people are dealing with limitation. Limited money, limited mobility, limited legal rights, limited safety, and again, cooks turn limitation into something generous. They do not erase the cruelty around them. They feed through it. In the Reconstruction and post-Reconstruction South, food vending also gave some black women unusual public presence. A woman selling chicken at a depot was visible in a commercial space. She negotiated with strangers. She handled cash. She built a customer base. She sometimes supported entire households. That visibility could bring opportunity, but also scrutiny. Local officials, railroad companies, and white competitors could regulate, restrict, or push vendors aside when their presence became inconvenient. Success did not make them safe. It made them noticeable. As railroads modernized, dining cars expanded, station restaurants improved, and corporate control tightened. Many independent vendors lost ground. The same pattern repeats across food history. Informal skill creates a market. Institutions notice the profit. Rules appear. Licenses appear. Contracts appear. The original sellers are edged away. What had been living commerce becomes managed service. The platform basket gives way to the company counter. But the memory did not vanish. Fried chicken kept its association with travel, with church picnics, with Sunday meals packed after service, with family visits, with road food, with care wrapped in paper. It became one of those dishes that could say, without saying it directly, somebody thought about you before you got hungry. That emotional power is hard to franchise, but companies would certainly try. Before that happened, fried chicken had to pass through a more poisonous cultural machine. The very visibility that made black chicken vendors successful also made the dish easier for racists to caricature. White audiences who bought the food, praised the cooking, and depended on black labor began turning the association between black people and fried chicken into mockery, advertisements, stage performances, postcards, songs, and jokes flattened a history of skill and enterprise into a sneer. This was theft followed by insult, and the insult would last. Yet the dish itself remained larger than the stereotype. It stayed in black homes and churches. It stayed in women's hands, in business, in mutual aid, in celebration, in grief. It stayed because it was useful and loved. It stayed because no caricature can fully own what a community continues to define for itself. By the early 20th century, fried chicken had become deeply American, but not peacefully American. It carried entrepreneurship and exclusion, comfort and danger, pride and ridicule. It had fed passengers through train windows. It had supported women shut out of other markets. It had turned portability into power. And now, as mass media grew louder, the fight over its meaning was about to become uglier. By the early 20th century, fried chicken had become one of the most emotionally loaded foods in America. It was Sunday dinner. It was travel food. It was church supper food. It was food carried in baskets, wrapped in paper, sold through train windows, and served at family tables with pride. It was skill, memory, labor, and care. Then the caricature machine got hold of it. You have to understand what was happening around the dish. After Reconstruction, white supremacist politics rebuilt power across the South through Jim Crow laws, voter suppression, racial terror, segregated schools, segregated rail cars, segregated hospitals, segregated restaurants, segregated cemeteries, and violence that was often public by design. Lynching was not hidden in the way polite memory sometimes pretends. Crowds gathered, photographs were taken, postcards were sold. Politicians looked away, encouraged it, or participated in the culture that made it possible. This was not a side issue in American life, it was the structure. Inside that structure, food became one of the ways racism made itself feel casual. Minstrel shows, advertisements, cartoons, postcards, restaurant signs, jokes, and household objects took ordinary foods associated with black life and turned them into weapons of mockery. Watermelon, pork, greens, fried chicken. These foods were not shameful. They were practical, meaningful, and often delicious. The shame belonged to the people who converted them into tools of humiliation. Fried chicken became trapped in a cruel contradiction. White Americans loved the cooking, relied on black domestic workers to prepare it, bought it from black vendors, praised it in private, and then mocked black people for eating it. That is not irony in the light sense, that is power showing its face. Enjoy the labor, insult the laborer. The stereotype worked because it reduced black people to appetite. It suggested childishness, laziness, animal instinct, lack of restraint, and comic excess. It took a dish shaped by skill and history and made it into a prop. In racist stage performances, black characters were shown stealing chickens, craving chickens, dancing for chickens, or being foolish around chickens. The point was never the food itself. The point was to tell white audiences that black dignity could be laughed away. This is the part that should make you angry, because a stereotype is not just a bad image, it is a story that does political work. If you can make a people look ridiculous, you can make their exclusion seem natural. If you can turn their food into a joke, you can ignore the entrepreneurship behind it. If you can portray their hunger as comedy, you can avoid talking about the economic system that produced that hunger. That is how cruelty becomes background noise, and it was everywhere. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, racist trade cards and advertisements used exaggerated black figures to sell products. Popular entertainment repeated the imagery. Children saw it. Adults laughed at it. Companies profited from it. The repetition did what repetition always does. It made the lie feel familiar, and familiarity is one of the most dangerous disguises a lie can wear. Meanwhile, real black families kept cooking, that matters, because the public image was ugly. But the private and community meaning of fried chicken did not disappear. In black homes, the dish could still mean celebration. In churches, it could still anchor meals after service. At funerals, it could arrive with casseroles, cakes, pies, and quiet condolences. At reunions, it could mark abundance. On road trips, it could protect families from the dangers of segregated restaurants. In boarding houses and small businesses, it could still generate income. Racism tried to flatten the dish. People kept it three-dimensional. There is a deep kind of resistance in that. Not the kind always recorded in speeches or court cases, but the kind that lives in repetition, cooking anyway, feeding anyway, gathering anyway, teaching the next person how much flour, how much pepper, how to watch the oil, how to keep the crust from sliding off, how to make the breast meat stay tender, how to save the drippings for gravy. No slogan, still resistance. Food does not have to be pure to be powerful. Fried chicken carried pain and pleasure at the same time. Some people avoided eating it publicly because of the stereotype. Others refused to let racists define what belonged to them. Some felt embarrassment imposed from outside. Others felt pride rooted from within. Both reactions make sense. That is what racism does to culture. It forces people to negotiate the meaning of ordinary things. A meal becomes a calculation. A public bite becomes a risk. And yet, fried chicken continued to cross lines because taste has its own stubborn force. White Southern cooks also claim the dish as regional heritage, often without acknowledging black influence. Restaurants served it as country cooking. Hotels served it to tourists. Cookbooks printed recipes that treated Southern food as charming and old-fashioned while leaving out the forced labor, black expertise, and racial politics that shaped it. This was not memory. It was editing. The editing became especially visible in the mythology of the Southern plantation after the Civil War, and especially in the early 20th century. Lost Cause nostalgia tried to soften slavery into a fantasy of loyal servants, gracious mansions, and abundant tables. Food played a role in that fantasy. Fried chicken, biscuits, beaten biscuits, cakes, ham, preserves, and elaborate suppers appeared in stories that made the Old South look warm and generous. But generosity built on bondage is not generosity. It is theft with good table settings. Think about that for a second. The same dish could appear in a black church basement as community care, in a white hotel dining room as regional romance, and in a racist cartoon as mockery. The chicken did not change. The power around it did. That is why fried chicken is such a revealing food. It shows you how culture gets made, stolen, sold, degraded, defended, and loved all at once. It shows you that a recipe can carry conflict even when it tastes like comfort. It shows you that ordinary objects are never as ordinary as they look. By the 1930s and 1940s, fried chicken has become deeply embedded in American popular culture. Home economists wrote recipes. Roadside restaurants served it. Families argued about the proper fat, the proper coating, the proper pan, the proper seasoning. Some insisted on lard, some used shortening, some dredged only in flour, some dipped in egg or milk, some soaked in buttermilk, some fried covered, then uncovered. Some swore by cast iron because cast iron held heat like a grudge. That last part is not science exactly, but anyone who's inherited a skillet understands. At the same time, the poultry industry was changing beneath the table. Farmers, scientists, feed companies, hatcheries, and processors were beginning to make chicken more standardized, more available, and eventually far cheaper. What had once been Sunday food was moving toward weeknight food. What had once been a household bird was becoming an industrial product. The old cultural meanings were still there, but a new machine was warming up behind them. And when industrial chicken met the automobile age, everything accelerated, roads improved, car ownership spread. Families drove farther. Travelers needed fast meals. Restaurants learned that fried chicken had nearly everything a roadside business could want. It smelled wonderful. It felt familiar. It could be served in pieces. It could be branded as Southern, country, home style, secret, special, and traditional. Even when it was being turned into a repeatable commercial formula. Pay attention to that word, repeatable. The future of fried chicken would depend on making the unpredictable predictable. Same bird size, same cooking time, same pressure, same seasoning, same box, same promise. A dish shaped by memory, skill. And local variation was about to meet standardization. The skillet was becoming a system. And somewhere in Kentucky, an aging roadside cook with white hair, a white suit, a talent for self-invention, and a recipe he would not stop talking about was preparing to turn that system into an empire. Then came the machine age of the chicken, not the machine age of the fryer first, the bird itself. For most of human history, chickens grew at the pace. Chickens grew, they scratched, they nested, they escaped. They laid eggs according to season, breed, daylight, and health. They were not uniform. Some were small, some were tough. Some were excellent layers, but poor meat birds. Some had dark feathers, some pale, some bodies narrow enough that a modern shopper might wonder what had gone wrong. Nothing had gone wrong. That was chicken before industry. The transformation began quietly in the early 20th century, as American farming changed from household production to commercial specialization. Rural families had long kept chickens as part of mixed farms, with women often managing poultry and egg money. That detail matters because poultry was sometimes one of the few farm enterprises where women controlled at least a portion of income. Egg sales could buy fabric, school supplies, sugar, shoes, or household goods. A flock in the yard was not decoration. It was a small economy with feathers. But as cities grew and transport improved, demand for poultry increased. People wanted more eggs, more meat, more consistency, and lower prices. Hatcheries expanded. Feed companies studied formulas, refrigeration improved, trucks connected farms to processing plants and markets. Scientists paid attention to breeding. The chicken was no longer only a creature of the yard. It was becoming a product line. Here is the detail that changes everything. The modern meat chicken, the broiler, was bred to become meat quickly. In the 1920s and 1930s, specialized broiler production grew especially on the Delmarva Peninsula, the region including Delaware and parts of Maryland and Virginia. One often repeated origin story centers on Cecile Steele, a Delaware farmer who in 1923 reportedly received 500 chicks instead of the 50 she'd ordered. Rather than discard the extra birds, she raised them for meat and sold them. The story has been retold so often that it has become poultry folklore, and its exact shape depends on the source. But the broader point is solid. Commercial broiler farming took off in that region and helped change what chicken meant in American life. A mistake, or something remembered as a mistake, became a business model. That is how industries love to tell their birth stories. Accidents make capitalism sound charming. The less charming reality was the steady application of science, capital, and control. Producers selected birds for faster growth, larger breasts, better feed conversion, and predictable bodies. Feed became more standardized, housing became more intensive, processing became more centralized. Birds that once took months to reach table size could eventually be raised in a fraction of that time. The supermarket chicken was being invented before most shoppers understood what had happened. This was not just agriculture, it was redesign. During the 1940s, the United States held contests known as Chicken of Tomorrow competitions, backed by industry groups and supported by major grocery interests. The goal was to blunt breed a better meat chicken, bigger, faster, more efficient, more uniform. The winning strains helped shape the genetics of the modern broiler industry. That phrase, chicken of tomorrow, sounds almost sweet, like a children's exhibit at a county fair. It was not sweet, it was a blueprint. The chicken of tomorrow became the chicken of everywhere, and once chicken meat became cheaper and more consistent, fried chicken businesses had a foundation they had never had before. A restaurant could not scale nationally if every bird arrived in a different size, cooked at a different pace, and cost unpredictably. Standardization made speed possible. Speed made franchising possible. Franchising made obsession possible. Now turn back to Harlan Sanders. He was born in 1890 in Indiana, not Kentucky. A fact that slightly complicates the mythology but never slowed the marketing department. His childhood was difficult. His father died when Sanders was young, and he learned to cook early while helping care for younger siblings. He worked many jobs farmhand: streetcar conductor, railroad fireman, insurance salesman, ferryboat operator, tire salesman, and service station owner. He was not a polished corporate founder with a neat business school arc. He was restless, stubborn, theatrical, and exceptionally good at selling himself. In the 1930s, Sanders began serving meals to travelers from his service station in Corbin, Kentucky. There was no grand fried chicken empire yet. There was a dining table, hungry motorists, and a man who understood that food could make a gasoline stop memorable. His reputation grew. Kentucky's governor gave him the honorary title of colonel in 1935, part of the state's tradition of ceremonial colonelcies. He wore the title so effectively that it became difficult to separate the man from the costume. White suit, black string tie, goatee, cane. A brand before branding swallowed everything, but Sanders faced a practical problem. Traditional fried chicken took too long for a roadside restaurant. pan-frying bone-in chicken properly could take around half an hour or more, depending on the method. Travellers did not always want to wait, cook it too fast. And the outside burned while the inside stayed underdone, cook it carefully, and customers might leave before the bird was ready. Then pressure cooking entered the story. Pressure cooking uses sealed steam pressure to raise the boiling point of water, cooking food faster. Sanders adapted pressure cookers to fry chicken under pressure, though early equipment could be dangerous and had to be handled carefully. Later commercial pressure fryers would become central to the chain's method, allowing chicken to cook faster while retaining moisture and producing a consistent crust. This was the turning point. Not the secret herbs, not the white suit, not even the title kernel, speed. In food history, speed is often the difference between a beloved local dish and a scalable empire. A slow dish can be wonderful. A fast dish can be sold repeatedly to strangers with schedules. Sanders figured out that fried chicken could be made to feel home-style while operating like a system. It could taste personal while being standardized. It could carry the aura of a Sunday table into the tempo of the automobile age. That was brilliant. It was also perfectly timed. Post-war America was filling with cars, highways, suburbs, motels, roadside signs, family vacations, and a new expectation that meals should be available away from home. The old town-centered travel landscape was giving way to a road network built for motion. Restaurants no longer needed only local regulars. They needed passing drivers. They needed visibility. They needed speed, parking, cleanliness, and a promise you could understand from the road. Fried chicken had the promise. Crisp, hot, familiar by 1952. Sanders franchised his recipe to Pete Harmon, a restaurant owner in Salt Lake City, Utah. Harmon helped develop key elements of the Kentucky Fried Chicken business, including the bucket meal concept. That detail is worth noticing. The first franchise success was not in Kentucky, it was in Utah. The Southern symbol was already leaving the South. And the bucket was genius. A bucket of chicken turned individual pieces into a family event. It suggested abundance. It travelled well. It looked generous. It could sit in the centre of a table, a car seat, a picnic blanket, or a motel room. It made takeout feel like a shared mid-meal instead of a compromise. The container became part of the ritual. Packaging was not packaging. Packaging was theatre. If you are finding this interesting, hit subscribe. We cover stories like this every week, and you will not want to miss what comes next. Because what came next was not simply a restaurant chain. It was the conversion of a regional food memory into a reproducible corporate asset. Sanders travelled relentlessly, cooking for potential franchisees, inspecting restaurants, promoting the recipe, and collecting royalties. The old man in the white suit became a living logo, and the logo became more famous than most actual kernels in history, which is probably fair, because most kernels did not sell gravy. By the 1960s, Kentucky Fried Chicken was expanding rapidly. The company would soon change hands, grow beyond Sanders's direct control, and enter a corporate world where image, consistency, and growth mattered more than the founder's personal approval. Sanders himself often complained about changes, especially to gravy and quality. The brand used his face, while the man behind the face became increasingly cranky about what the brand was doing. There is something almost perfect about that. The symbol outgrew the person, and once that happened, fried chicken entered a new age, not simply cooked in homes, not simply sold at platforms, not simply served in diners, but franchised, standardized, exported, advertised, and measured in units. territories, royalties, and market share. The Skillet had become a corporation. Once Kentucky Fried Chicken began to spread, fried chicken changed scale, not flavor first, scale. A single restaurant could be personal. A local fried chicken place could depend on one cook, one stove, one neighborhood, one reputation, and one memory of how the chicken tasted last Sunday. But a franchise had to do something stranger. It had to promise that a customer in Utah, Kentucky, Ohio, California, Canada, or eventually Singapore could walk through the door and receive something recognizably the same. That was the magic trick. Same bird, same pressure, same seasoning, same red and white signs, same smiling colonel watching over the transaction like a ghost of Southern hospitality turned into graphic design. By the mid-1960s, Kentucky Fried Chicken had hundreds of outlets. Harlan Sanders sold the company in 1964 to a group of investors led by John Y. Brown Jr. and Jack Massey for about $2 million, roughly equivalent to many millions in today's money. Sanders remained the public face of the brand, and that arrangement was both brilliant and awkward. The new owners got the Colonel's image, the Colonel got wealth and fame, and the company got a living mascot who still had opinions. Many opinions. Sanders was not shy about criticizing the food after he no longer controlled it. He complained about gravy. He complained about quality. He complained that some restaurants did not meet his standards. Imagine selling your name, your image, and your recipe, then watching strangers use all three at a scale you could never personally supervise. That was not retirement. That was haunting your own brand while still alive. But the brand kept growing because it understood the post-war world. Families were busier, suburbs spread outward, cars reshaped daily life, more women entered paid work, though they were still expected to manage household meals. Television advertising entered the home. Fast food chains learned to sell not only food, but relief. Relief from cooking, relief from dishes, relief from deciding, relief from the old expectation that a proper family meal had to be made from scratch every night. Fried chicken was perfect for that promise because it felt like real cooking. A hamburger was quick and urban. A hot dog was casual. Pizza was communal and adaptable. Fried chicken, however, carried the emotional weight of home. It looked like something a grandmother could have made, even when it came in a branded bucket from a fluorescent counter. That contradiction was the entire business. Industrial food wearing an apron, and it worked. The bucket meal turned out to be one of the great containers in food marketing. It was not elegant. It was not subtle. It was a tub of chicken, but it suggested abundance with almost comic directness. You did not buy a delicate portion. You bought enough to reach into, enough for children, enough for the table, enough to look generous. In a country where convenience often felt suspicious, the bucket made takeout look like family dinner. The sides helped too. Mashed potatoes, gravy, coleslaw, biscuits, corn, beans, and later variations depending on market and era gave the meal a familiar structure. Meat, starch, vegetable, bread. It did not feel like eating a snack. It felt like outsourcing supper. Pay attention to that distinction. Fast food usually succeeds when it stops feeling like a compromise. KFC sold the idea that you were not failing to cook, you were bringing home a treat. But the company's rise also depended on a careful packaging of southernness. The word Kentucky did heavy work. For many Americans, Kentucky suggested bluegrass, horse farms, bourbon, front porches, manners, and old-fashioned cooking. The Colonel's white suit suggested gentility without requiring anyone to examine what Southern gentility had historically concealed. The brand turned the South into flavor, costume, and hospitality. It removed the plantation and kept the porch. It removed black labor and kept the seasoning. It removed segregation and kept the word tradition. This is one of the uncomfortable realities of American food branding. Companies often sell regional identity after sanding down the conflicts that made that identity. Fried chicken could be marketed as Southern comfort without explaining slavery, black culinary skill, train platform vendors, Jim Crow travel, or racist caricature. The bucket could carry a story, but only the parts that helped sales. That does not mean every customer was thinking about history when they ordered dinner. Most were hungry. Many genuinely loved the taste. Children did not see a corporate strategy when the lid opened and steam rose. They saw chicken. But cultural memory can be edited even when no one at the table feels like they're editing it. The omission becomes normal. Meanwhile, KFC moved abroad. And something fascinating happened. A food marketed in the United States as Southern became, in other countries, a symbol of America itself. The Colonel became a kind of edible ambassador, not an official one, a stranger one, white-haired, smiling, holding a bucket. By the 1970s and 1980s, KFC had restaurants in multiple international markets, and its success overseas showed the adaptability of fried chicken at corporate scale. Chicken had advantages that beef and pork did not always have. It was acceptable in many food cultures where pork was restricted by religion. It was less burdened than beef in places where cattle held special status, or where beef was costly. It could be seasoned locally. It could be cut, sauced, spiced, sweetened, or served with rice, noodles, fries, flatbread, or local side dishes. Chicken travelled well once again. The old Jungle Bird had always been portable. Now the franchise was portable too. In Japan, KFC found one of its strangest and most famous cultural roles. During the 1970s, a marketing campaign helped connect fried chicken with Christmas, a holiday not traditionally centered in Japanese religious life for most people. The phrase, often rendered as Kentucky for Christmas, became part of a seasonal ritual, and families began ordering chicken meals for Christmas celebrations. The origins of the campaign have been retold in slightly different ways over time, as marketing legends tend to be, but the outcome is clear. Fried chicken became festive through advertising. A bucket became holiday food. That is ridiculous. It is also brilliant. In China, KFC's later success would become even larger when the chain opened in Beijing in 1987, near Tiananmen Square. It arrived at a moment when China was opening to foreign business and consumer culture in new ways. KFC adapted more aggressively than many Western brands, adding local menu items, emphasizing spacious restaurants, and positioning itself not merely as American fast food, but as a modern, family-friendly place to eat. Over time, China became one of KFC's most important markets. This was not simple cultural conquest. It was negotiation. The menu changed, the setting changed, the meaning changed. In some places, KFC represented American modernity. In others, convenience. In others, novelty. In others, a treat for children. In others, a reliable restroom and air conditioning, which sounds minor until you remember that restaurants are also physical spaces where people rest, meet, wait, and feel temporarily cared for. A chain sells food, it also sells a place to sit, By the end of the 20th century, the Colonel had become one of the most recognizable food figures on Earth. The company passed through corporate owners, including large conglomerates, and later became part of the restaurant group now known as Yum Brands. The brand survived because it could be local and global at the same time, red and white on the outside, local adaptations on the tray. That balance became the template for modern fast food globalization. Keep the logo, adjust the flavor, sell consistency, permit difference. The result was staggering. A dish rooted in household labor, racial history, regional cooking, and roadside entrepreneurship became a multinational corporate product. Fried chicken no longer needed a grandmother, a station vendor, a Sunday table, or a cast iron pan. It needed supply chains, franchise agreements, poultry contracts, training manuals, pressure fryers, advertising budgets, and real estate. And yet, somehow, the emotional illusion remained. People still spoke about crispness, juiciness, secret seasoning, comfort, cravings. The machine had grown enormous, but the bite still pretended to be intimate. That is the strange genius of fried chicken. It can be industrial and still feel personal. By the time KFC became an empire, other businesses had learned the lesson. The market was wide open. Buckets were only the beginning. Wings, sandwiches, nuggets, strips, sports bars, convenience stores, and regional chains were waiting for their moment. The Colonel had proved that fried chicken could travel the world. Now everyone wanted a piece. Once the bucket proved fried chicken could become a national and international business, the bird began splitting into new forms. Pieces became wings. Wings became events. Events became television food. Television food became delivery food. Delivery food became something you could order with one thumb while half watching a game from a couch. This is where fried chicken stopped being only a meal and became entertainment. The wing is a perfect place to see it happen. Because of much of American food history, the wing was not the prize. The breast was cleaner, the thigh was richer, the drumstick was easy to hold and dramatic in a child's hand. The wing was small, bony, awkward, and easy to overlook. It had skin, joints, cartilage, and not much meat. In a household kitchen, it might go into stock. In a restaurant, it could be cheap. That cheapness mattered. In 1964, in Buffalo, New York, a bar called the Anchor Bar became associated with the now famous Buffalo Wing deep-fried chicken wings, tossed in a buttery hot sauce and served with celery and blue cheese dressing. The Teresa Bellissimo origin story is the version most people know, with late-night improvisation, hungry customers, and a family bar turning scraps into gold. As with many food origin stories, the details have been told in competing ways by different people connected to the place. But the broader transformation is not in doubt. Buffalo wings turned one of the least glamorous chicken parts into a national obsession. Think about that for a second. A bony leftover became stadium currency. That is not an exaggeration. Wings fit the sports bar age almost too perfectly. They were spicy, salty, shareable, messy, and repetitive. You could eat one, then another, barely noticing the count until the plate was a graveyard of bones. They encouraged beer. They encouraged napkins. They encouraged watching rather than dining. A knife and fork would have ruined the point. The mess was part of the ritual. This was not refined cuisine. It was participation. By the late 20th century, sports bars, casual chains, pizza restaurants, And wing specialists had learned that wings could anchor an entire social environment. The rise of televised sports created long windows of eating, football games, basketball games, boxing nights, and later mixed martial arts events gave restaurants a reason to sell food in piles. The meal did not have to resolve quickly. It could stretch across quarters, innings, rounds, and commercial breaks. The chicken became a clock. Order before kickoff, eat through halftime, reorder in the fourth quarter, regret nothing until morning. At the same time, chicken chains multiplied. Popeyes, founded in New Orleans in 1972 by Al Copeland, built its identity around Louisiana-style seasoning, red beans and rice, biscuits, and a sharper flavor profile than the gentler national image of KFC. Church's Chicken, begun in San Antonio in 1952, grew from a small operation into a major chain. Bojangles, founded in Charlotte in 1977, tied fried chicken to biscuits, breakfast, and a Carolina sense of place. Regional chains became identity markers. People did not simply choose chicken, they chose a style, a side, a sauce, a memory, a hometown argument. That argument mattered more than advertising departments could ever fully control. One person's perfect fried chicken is another person's dry mistake. One person wants peppery crust, another wants mild crispness. One wants bone-in, another wants tenders. One wants gravy, another wants hot sauce. One believes the biscuit is essential. Another believes the fries are the test. Some people judge by skin, some by juiciness, some by the leftover cold piece eaten at midnight in front of the refrigerator. That last test is private, but important. As fried chicken commercialized, boneless forms became increasingly powerful. Nuggets, tenders, strips, popcorn chicken, and sandwiches changed the relationship between eater and bird. Bone-in chicken reminds you, at least a little, that an animal had a shape. Boneless chicken removes that shape. It turns meat into units, dip-friendly, child-friendly, car-friendly, desk-friendly units. Convenience loves a rectangle. Chicken nuggets entered mass culture in the late 20th century, especially through fast food. They were not fried chicken in the old Sunday sense, but they belonged to the same empire of battered, breaded poultry. They trained generations to think of chicken as soft, uniform, sauce-dependent, and almost abstract. Children learned barbecue sauce, honey mustard, ranch, sweet and sour, and later endless branded dips as part of the experience. The sauce was no longer decoration, it was interface. That sounds silly, it is not. Sauces let chains create variety without changing the core product too much. The same chicken can become spicy, sweet, smoky, tangy, garlicky, or limited edition with a new dip cup. In business terms, that is beautiful. In cultural terms, it is a little strange. A bird domesticated near rice fields thousands of years ago is now being reintroduced to the public through seasonal sauce drops. Food history has a sense of humour. Then came the chicken sandwich wars. Fried chicken sandwiches existed long before the 21st century. But in the late 2010s, they became a national spectacle in the United States. Popeyes released a fried chicken sandwich in 2019 that triggered huge lines. Social media frenzy, sellouts, brand battles, and breathless coverage usually reserved for elections, disasters, or celebrity scandals. Think about the absurdity. A piece of fried chicken on a bun with pickles and sauce became a public event. People compared crust thickness. They argued about bun softness. They debated mayo. They waited in drive-through lines as if entering a concert. And the companies watched the numbers climb. This was fried chicken fully adapted to internet culture. The product was not only eaten, it was posted, reviewed, ranked, photographed, joked about, and weaponized in brand accounts. Craving became content. Lunch became discourse. A sandwich could trend before someone even tasted it. This was not about hunger alone. It was attention. Meanwhile, delivery apps changed the geography of fried chicken again. A dish that once moved from home kitchen to church table, from basket to train window, from roadside counter to family car, now moved through digital platforms. Ghost kitchens appeared. Virtual brands sold wings from kitchens customers never saw. Restaurants optimized packaging to preserve crispness during the ride. That is harder than it sounds. Steam is the enemy of crunch. A perfect crust can turn soft in a closed box if the journey is too long. Modern fried chicken has to survive logistics. Again, portability becomes destiny. Sports nights, office lunches, family takeout, late-night cravings, viral sandwiches, and delivery bundles all pushed fried chicken deeper to everyday life. It became both special and routine, which is a rare commercial achievement. You can serve it at a party, grab it alone in a car, order it for children, put it beside champagne at a wedding after party, or eat it cold while standing in pajama pants under kitchen light. No judgment. Well, maybe a little, but behind the jokes, the scale was growing enormous. The demand for wings affected prices. The demand for breast meat reshaped breeding priorities. The demand for tenders created pressure on processing. The demand for cheap, abundant chicken required a supply chain capable of producing birds at speeds earlier farmers could barely imagine. And that leads to the part of the story hidden farthest from the table. The factory, the hatchery, the grow-out house, the feed mill, the processing line, the workers in cold rooms, the birds bred for bodies that grow with astonishing speed, the contracts that bind farmers to companies, the antibiotics debates, the welfare campaigns, the question no glossy advertisement wants to linger on for too long. How did fried chicken become so cheap? The answer is not inside the bucket, it is behind it. The cheapness of fried chicken is not natural. It feels natural now because abundance has a way of erasing the machinery that produced it. You walk into a supermarket and see rows of chicken breasts under plastic. You pass a drive-through and see a meal deal glowing on a menu board. You open a delivery app and find wings, tenders, sandwiches, nuggets, buckets, combos, sauces, family packs, and late-night specials waiting behind small photographs of crisp golden crust. It looks effortless. It is not. Behind every piece of fried chicken is a system that begins long before the fryer. It begins with breeding companies selecting genetic lines for rapid growth, broad breast muscles, efficient feed conversion, and predictable size. It begins with hatcheries where eggs are incubated in enormous numbers. It moves through feed mills that turn corn, soy, vitamins, minerals, and additives into calibrated diets. It passes into long poultry houses where thousands, sometimes tens of thousands, of birds grow under controlled light, temperature, ventilation, and feeding schedules. The chicken has become biological infrastructure. That phrase sounds cold because the system is cold, not emotionally cold in every individual case, since many farmers work hard and care about their animals, but structurally cold. The modern broiler is designed around measurement, weight gain, mortality, feed conversion, processing yield, days to market, pounds per square foot, cost per pound. The bird is not only an animal in this system, it is data with feathers. And the numbers are startling. Over the last century, meat chickens have been bred to grow far faster and larger than their ancestors. A bird that once might have taken many months to reach a modest table size can now reach market weight in roughly 6 to 7 weeks in many industrial systems. 6 to 7 weeks. The body has been pushed towards speed with a precision that would have seemed impossible to the small farmers of the 19th century. This was not simply better farming. It was acceleration. The industry often describes this as efficiency, and in one sense, it is. Modern broilers convert feed into meat, with remarkable effectiveness compared with many larger livestock animals. That efficiency helps explain why chicken became one of the dominant meats of the modern world. It can be cheaper than beef. It avoids some religious barriers associated with pork or cattle. It works across many cuisines. It can be sold whole, cut up boneless, ground, breaded, frozen, sauced and branded. But efficiency has shadows. One shadow falls on the birds themselves. Fast-growing broilers can face welfare problems tied to their body's leg disorders. Difficulty walking, cardiovascular strain, heat stress, and the sheer burden of rapid weight gain. Animal welfare groups have pushed for slower growing breeds, lower stocking densities, better litter management, more light, and more room for natural behaviours. Producers and retailers respond in different ways, sometimes with real reforms, sometimes with careful language that sounds more generous than it is. Pay attention to the labels. Cage-free does not mean the same thing as pasture-raised. Natural does not mean the bird lived outdoors. No antibiotics ever does not tell you how crowded the house was. Free range may mean access to the outside, but not necessarily that every bird wandered through grass like a painting on an egg carton. Food marketing often speaks in soft focus images. Industrial farming speaks in contracts. Those contracts are the next shadow. Many poultry farmers do not own the birds they raise. Large companies often supply chicks, feed, veterinary protocols, and processing schedules, while farmers own or finance the poultry houses, equipment, land, utilities, and debt. This arrangement can leave growers dependent on the company that controls the flock, the feed, the timing, and the payment system. Some farmers do well, others struggle under loans and upgrades they're pressured to make. When people talk about cheap chicken, they rarely picture the farmer whose income depends on a company ranking system and a house full of birds he or she may never truly own. Cheap at the counter can mean expensive somewhere else. Then there are the workers. Processing plants are among the most demanding workplaces in the food system. The rooms can be cold and wet. The lines move quickly. The work can involve cutting, deboning, trimming, hanging, packing, and repeating the same motion again and again until the body begins to fail. Hands swell, wrists ache, shoulders burn, knives slip, chemical cleaners sting. The smell is metallic, damp, and unforgettable. Many workers are immigrants, people of colour, or people with limited economic options, which makes the labour easier for the public to overlook. This is not just a labour issue, it is part of the price. The lower the price of chicken, the more pressure there is to move birds quickly through the system. The more pressure there is to move birds quickly, the more pressure falls on the people and animals inside that system. A discount sandwich can look like a gift to the customer, because the cost has been distributed elsewhere. Into debt, injury, pollution, and pain, not always visibly, but really. Industrial poultry also reshaped landscapes. Large numbers of birds produce large amounts of manure in some regions. Poultry waste can pollute waterways if poorly managed, carrying nitrogen, phosphorus, and bacteria into rivers and coastal ecosystems. Feed production links chicken to vast acres of corn and soy. Global demand connects the fryer to fertilizer, fuel, shipping, land use. On climate questions, the chicken piece in your hand may feel small, but it sits inside an agricultural map that reaches far beyond the restaurant. That is the strange scale of modern food. Tiny bite, enormous system. There is another surprise. Fried chicken is not only about restaurants anymore. It is also about global commodity flows. Wings may be prized in one market while feet are valuable in another. Dark meat may be exported when domestic consumers prefer white meat. Frozen parts move across borders according to taste, price, trade policy, disease outbreaks, tariffs, and currency shifts. A bird processed in one region can become many different products for many different consumers. Nothing is wasted because everything can be priced. Even the parts that one culture ignores may become valuable somewhere else. Chicken feet, for example, are an important export product in markets where they are enjoyed for texture, collagen, and flavor. To some American shoppers, they may look like waste. To others, they are food. That contrast should humble anyone who thinks their own meat case is the natural order of the world. The bird is global because desire is not the same everywhere. Still, the central engine remains the same: produce more chicken, more cheaply, more predictably, for more people. And there is a real democratic power in that. Affordable protein matters. Families on tight budgets rely on chicken. Small restaurants build menus around it. Street vendors use it. School lunches serve it. Fried chicken can be a joy, a livelihood, a celebration, and a practical meal all at once. The problem is not that people love chicken. The problem is when love becomes an excuse not to look. Because every era of this story has had something hidden under the crust. In the ancient world, it was ritual and violence in the arena. In the plantation south, it was forced labor. In the age of segregation, it was humiliation beside comfort. In the fast food era, it is industrial scale hiding behind nostalgia. The crunch is real. So is the cost. And yet fried chicken keeps changing, because people keep making it their own. Even under the pressure of global supply chains and corporate menus, cooks still adapt it, argue over it, season it, reinvent it, and attach it to place. That is where the story moves next. Away from the factory floor and back into the astonishing creativity of kitchens around the world. Seoul, Tokyo, Lagos, Nashville. The bird is about to travel again. The most revealing thing about fried chicken is that it never stays still. It lands in a country, and almost immediately someone changes it. Someone changes the flour, someone changes the fat, someone changes the sauce, someone changes the side dish, the drinking ritual, the heat level, the cut of meat, the occasion, the packaging, the hour of night when it tastes best. That is not corruption. That is the point. A food becomes global only when it can stop belonging to one place without becoming meaningless. Fried chicken does this better than almost anything. It can be Southern and Korean, Japanese and Nigerian, Caribbean and British, Nashville and Filipino. fast food and grandmother food, street food and restaurant food, birthday food and breakup food. It survives translation because the basic promise is so direct. Crisp outside, juicy inside, salt, fat, heat. Everything else can move. Start in South Korea, where fried chicken has become one of the world's great modern food cultures. Korean fried chicken is often double fried, a method that drives moisture from the surface and creates a thinner, glacier crust than many American versions. The chicken may be tossed in sweet, spicy gochujang sauce, brushed with soy garlic glaze, dusted with cheese powder, paired with pickled radish, or served plain so the crackle can speak for itself. It is frequently eaten with beer in the ritual known as chimaek, a blend of chicken and mekju, meaning beer. Chimaek is not just a meal, it is an evening plan. You can imagine it clearly: neon signs, metal tables, cold beer glasses sweating in the air, friends leaning in over shared plates, the smell of garlic, chili, and frying oil rising with conversation. The chicken arrives cut into pieces, lacquered red or shining bronze, and the pickled radish sits nearby like a small white reset button for the mouth. Bite, crunch, heat, beer, radish, repeat. The history behind it is layered. Fried chicken grew in South Korea partly through post-war American influence, changing poultry production, urban nightlife, and a restaurant culture that learned to make chicken social. After the Korean War, American military presence shaped tastes and food access in complicated ways. Later, as incomes rose and poultry became more available, chicken restaurants multiplied. By the late 20th and early 21st centuries, Korean fried chicken had become not an imitation of American chicken, but its own phenomenon. That is important. Influence is not ownership. Meanwhile, in Japan, karaage tells a different story. Karaage usually refers to bite-sized pieces of chicken, often thigh meat, marinated with soy sauce, ginger, garlic, and sometimes sake, then coated in potato starch or flour and fried. It can be served in izakaya pubs, lunchboxes, school meals, home kitchens, convenience stores, and festival stalls. The texture is different from southern fried chicken. The pieces are smaller. The seasoning runs through the meat. The crust can be delicate and crisp rather than heavy. Karaage is not trying to be a bucket meal. It is its own quiet genius. A convenience store piece of hot fried chicken in Japan can feel like one of the great modern absurdities: cheap, engineered, often surprisingly good. Waiting under a heat lamp beside train stations and office towers, the old road food has become commuter food. The station vendor has become fluorescent retail. The basket has become a paper sleeve. Different century, same need. Food that moves with people. Then there is Japan's Christmas chicken tradition, where Kentucky Fried Chicken became attached to holiday celebration through advertising in the 1970s. For many families, ordering KFC at Christmas became a seasonal custom. Not because fried chicken had ancient Japanese religious meaning, but because marketing, novelty, and modern celebration braided themselves together. That may sound artificial, but many traditions begin with repetition before they acquire emotional weight. Do it once, it is promotion. Do it every year, and children remember. Halfway around the world, in Nashville, Tennessee, hot chicken burns its own path through the story. Nashville hot chicken is fried chicken coated or brushed with a fiery paste of cayenne pepper, spices, and fat, usually served with white bread and pickles. Its most famous origin story centers on Thornton Prince, whose girlfriend supposedly punished his wandering eye by serving him brutally spicy chicken. Prince allegedly loved it, and a business was born. Whether every detail of that tale can be nailed down is less important than the institution that followed Prince's hot chicken shack. A landmark of black Nashville food culture. But do not let the funny origin story distract you. Hot chicken is serious. It is Heater's identity. It is pain turned into pleasure. It is a test, a ritual, a warning, and a dare. The white bread underneath is not decorative. It catches the orange oil. The pickles cut through the fire. The chicken stains your fingers. Your lips tingle. Your forehead may shine. You keep eating anyway because capsaicin has a strange way of turning discomfort into devotion. That is how spice builds loyalty. In West Africa and the African diaspora, fried chicken meets older traditions of pepper, rice, stew, smoke, and celebration. In Nigeria, Ghana, Sierra Leone, and beyond. Fried chicken often appears beside jollof rice, fried rice, plantains, salads, pepper sauce, or spiced tomato-based dishes. It can be party food, wedding food, takeaway food, or roadside food. The chicken may be seasoned deeply before frying, sometimes boiled or simmered first with spices, onions, and aromatics, then fried to finish. The result is not just crust on the outside, flavor begins inside. That method tells you something. Seasoning is not an accessory, it is architecture. In the Caribbean, fried chicken moves with jerk spice, curry memories, Scotch bonnet heat, festival bread, rice and peas, plantains, and diasporic adaptation. In Britain, fried chicken found a particular place in urban takeaway culture, especially in London and other cities shaped by Caribbean, South Asian, African, Middle Eastern, and working-class food traditions. Chicken shops became neighborhood fixtures. Cheap, bright, late, fragrant, sometimes mocked by outsiders, fiercely defended by regulars. A box of wings and chips after school or after work can carry more local meaning than a glossy restaurant ever will. Every city has a version of this, the food that outsiders dismiss, the food insiders understand. In the Philippines, fried chicken appears with gravy, rice, spaghetti, banana ketchup sweetness, and fast food culture shaped by local taste. In Brazil, frango a passarinho, little bird-style chicken pieces, are fried until crisp and often served with garlic, lime, and beer. In Taiwan, giant fried chicken cutlets became night market icons, pounded thin, seasoned, breaded, fried, and eaten from paper bags larger than some dinner plates. In Thailand, Gai Tod can arrive with fried shallots, sticky rice, and chili dipping sauce. In the American Midwest, broasted chicken made pressure-fried crispness a supper club and roadside tradition. In the Gulf states, chicken chains adapted to local spice preferences and halal requirements. Some are saucy, some are dry, some are fiery, some are gentle, some are eaten with rice, some with fries, some with bread, some with beer, some with tea, some standing up, some at weddings, some in cars, some at midnight, and underneath all of them is the same basic transformation a once living bird. Cut and seasoned, meeting hot fat until it becomes something louder than itself. This is why fried chicken became global, not because one corporation forced everyone to eat the same thing, though corporations certainly tried, not because one region owned the only correct method, though regions certainly argue. It became global because it is both specific and flexible. It gives cooks a structure, then lets them speak. The crust is the sentence, the seasoning is the accent, and after all this movement, the story is ready to return to your own hand, to the box on the counter, to the bite you take without thinking, to the billion-dollar industry humming behind it, to the forest bird still hiding, somehow, under the crunch. By the time fried chicken reaches the 21st century, it has become almost impossible to see the whole story at once. You see the sandwich, you see the bucket, you see the wings during a game, the tenders in a child's meal, the courage in a lunchbox, the Korean chicken under glossy sauce, the hot chicken glowing red with cayenne, the late-night box of wings and fries. The family pack carried home in a plastic bag warm enough to fog the windows. You do not see the jungle. You do not see the rooster as dawn guardian, the sacred bird watched by Roman priests, the chicken crossing the deserts and seas in baskets, the medieval cook saving fat because fat meant labour, the Scottish pan, the West African seasoning memory, the plantation kitchen, the black woman at the train platform, the racist postcard, the pressure fryer, the broiler house, the processing line, the franchise manual, the delivery driver waiting under an apartment light, but they are all there. Every bite is crowded. The modern market is enormous because fried chicken now lives in several economies at once. It is fast food, casual dining, supermarket prepared food, frozen food, catering food, convenience store food, stadium food, party food, and delivery food. It belongs to multinational chains and small corner shops. It belongs to old family restaurants and social media pop-ups. It belongs to neighborhood chicken shacks and ghost kitchens with names that exist mainly inside apps. It can be sold as nostalgia, indulgence, heat, crunch, protein, value, comfort, novelty, or challenge. Same basic form, endless commercial costumes. That is why companies keep returning to it. Chicken is comparatively adaptable across religious and cultural boundaries. It can be mild for children, fiery for thrill seekers, boneless for convenience, bone-in for tradition, breaded for crunch, grilled for the health halo, sauced for novelty, or packed into a sandwich for portability. It works with rice, bread, potatoes, noodles, beer, cola, pickles, gravy, honey, chili, garlic, soy, and almost every dip humans have been reckless enough to invent. Ranch alone could probably support a minor empire. But the obsession is not just taste, it is psychology. Fried chicken gives you contrast in the most direct possible form. The outside resists, then breaks. The inside gives way. The salt hits first, then fat, then spice, then meat, then whatever sauce or side dish resets the mouth for another bite. That sequence is almost musical. Crunch, warmth, juice, heat, relief, again and again. This is not fine dining complexity, it is bodily clarity. Modern food companies understand that clarity extremely well. They know that crispness photographs beautifully. They know that a sandwich cross-section can sell desire before the viewer smells anything. They know that limited-time sauces create urgency. They know that spicy versions encourage online challenges. They know that nostalgia lowers resistance. They know that calling something hand-breaded, home-style, country, original, famous, secret, or old-fashioned can make industrial food feel personal. Here is the uncomfortable reality. Fried chicken is now both a memory and a machine, and the machine has learned to manufacture memory. That does not make the memory fake. Your grandmother's chicken, your local shop's chicken, your road trip chicken, your wedding after-party chicken, your lunchbox chicken. Those meanings can be real, but they now live in a world where corporations study them, package them, and sell them back to you in branded form. That is not unique to fried chicken. It happens to coffee, bread, chocolate, tea, tacos, barbecue, noodles, and almost every comfort food that survives long enough to become profitable. But fried chicken is especially good at it because it feels handmade even when it is not. A nugget can be extruded, a tender can be frozen, a sandwich can be assembled by the thousand. Yet the golden crust whispers older things: hearth, table, basket, Sunday, family, care. The whisper sells. The future of fried chicken will likely be shaped by contradictions. Consumers want cheap food, but also better animal welfare. They want convenience, but also authenticity. They want fiery novelty, but also the exact flavor they remember. They want global variety, but also local identity. They want crispy delivery, which is basically asking steam to stop being steam. A demand no chicken can fully satisfy. Still, technology will keep trying. Packaging will vent more intelligently. Frying oils will be engineered and marketed. Plant-based chicken will improve, stumble, improve again, and try to win over people who love the idea of crunch more than the biology of the bird. Lab-grown meat may eventually enter the conversation in a meaningful way, though price, regulation, scale, and public trust will decide how far it goes. Restaurants will use automation where labor is costly or scarce. Apps will keep reorganizing what it means to order dinner. Viral trends will keep turning sandwiches into temporary civic emergencies. And somewhere, at the same time, someone will still be heating oil in a pan and listening, not to a timer first, to the sound. That is the thread that survives every empire. It was there when junglefowl stepped toward rice fields at the edge of Southeast Asian villages. It was there when roosters announced the morning and humans mistook, or maybe understood, that sound as power. It was there when ancient priests watched birds for omens and soldiers carried chickens across roads and frontiers. It was there when cooks discovered that hot fat could turn the surface of food into crackling gold. It was there when Scottish frying habits and West African seasoning knowledge met under the violent conditions of the Atlantic world. It was there when enslaved cooks made beauty inside a system built to deny their humanity. It was there when black women sold fried chicken through train windows and turned baskets into businesses. It was there when Jim Crow forced families to pack food for journeys through hostile roads. It was there when racist caricature tried to turn skill into shame, and communities kept cooking anyway. It was there when Harlan Sanders stood beside a pressure cooker and converted speed, seasoning, costume, and stubbornness into a franchise. It was there when the bucket crossed oceans, when wings became sports food, when sandwiches became internet drama, when Korean chimaek filled late-night tables, when Karaji warmed convenience store shelves, when Nashville hot chicken burned through white bread and pride. It was there in the factory too. In the uncomfortable places the advertisement avoids the breeding shed, the grow-out house, the cold processing room, the exhausted hands, the crowded birds, the ledger where efficiency becomes price. It was there because food history is never only what we like to remember. It is also what we prefer not to see. And now it is here, in your kitchen, in your car, in a paper box on your lap, in a bucket on a table, in a late-night order moving toward your door, in the small moment before the first bite, when the crust is still crisp and the steam is still trapped inside. Fried chicken is never just fried chicken. It is jungle, empire, slavery, travel, segregation, entrepreneurship, science, branding, labor, migration, and memory, all hidden beneath a crust that shatters in less than a second. Not bad for a nervous forest bird that wandered too close to the rice. If you enjoyed this journey, do me a favor and subscribe, like the video, and tell me in the comments which part of fried chicken's history surprised you most. There are many more everyday foods with enormous hidden histories, and I will see you in the next one. Sleep well.